Let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you in the comments. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from all corners of the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft hum in the background, and let's begin our journey together tonight. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Crimson Silk Emporium, illuminating bolts of fabric that seemed to capture light and transform it into liquid poetry. Lady Rosalind Fairfax moved through her domain with the grace of an oriental princess, her fingers trailing across silks that had traveled thousands of miles from the mysterious lands beyond the empire's borders to reach the most discerning customers in Victorian London. At 35, Rosalind possessed an exotic beauty that reflected her extensive travels throughout the Silk Road's ancient trade routes. Her dark hair was always adorned with pins of carved jade and ivory, while her clothing showcased fabrics that existed nowhere else in England, silks that shifted color with movement, patterns that seemed to tell stories of distant kingdoms, and textures that felt like captured moonlight against the skin. The Emporium itself had been designed to transport visitors into realms that most Londoners could only imagine through the pages of adventure novels. Crimson silk hangings created intimate alcoves where private consultations could be conducted, while ornate mirrors reflected light in ways that made every fabric appear more lustrous and every customer more beautiful. The air was perfumed with incense that carried hints of spice markets and temple gardens, creating an atmosphere that was both intoxicating and slightly otherworldly. But it was the quality of Rosalind's merchandise that truly set her establishment apart from every other fabric shop in the kingdom. Her silks possessed characteristics that seemed to defy conventional understanding of textile manufacturing, colors that remained vibrant despite exposure to light. The clientele that frequented Crimson Silk Emporium represented the pinnacle of society's elite, women whose wealth and status allowed them to indulge in luxuries that ordinary mortals could never afford. Duchess Margaret Ashworth had been among Rosalind's most devoted customers, her passion for exotic fabrics matched only by her determination to maintain her position as London's most fashionably dressed woman. At 42, the Duchess possessed the kind of refined beauty that came from a lifetime of privilege, along with the confidence that unlimited wealth provided in pursuing whatever caught her fancy. The consultation that would ultimately prove fatal had begun when Duchess Margaret had commissioned a complete wardrobe using Rosalind's newest acquisition, a silk that she described as having been woven from threads harvested in gardens that bloomed only during eclipses. The fabric possessed an otherworldly luminescence that seemed to enhance the wearer's natural radiance while creating an aura of mystery that conventional materials could never achieve. The fitting process had extended over several weeks, with Rosalind personally overseeing every detail of the garment's construction. Her attention to the Duchess's measurements had been extraordinarily precise, taking into account not only physical dimensions, but also the subtle aspects of posture and movement that would affect how the finished pieces would drape and flow. Each fitting had revealed new aspects of the silk's unusual properties, as the fabric seemed to adapt itself to its wearer's body with an almost sentient responsiveness. Duchess Margaret's delight with her new wardrobe had been evident from the moment she first tried on the completed garments. The silk enhanced her appearance in ways that seemed almost magical, making her skin glow with youthful radiance while creating silhouettes that emphasized her best features while minimizing any flaws that age might have introduced. She had immediately ordered additional pieces, declaring that she would never again wear any fabric that had not come from Rosalind's exclusive collection. The social triumph that followed the Duchess's debut in her new wardrobe had been everything that both women had hoped to achieve. Society's attention had focused on her transformed appearance, with fashion critics struggling to identify exactly what had created such dramatic improvement in her overall presentation. The mysterious qualities of Rosalind's silk had generated demand from other wealthy women who sought to achieve similar enhancements to their own appearance. But within weeks of her fashion triumph, Duchess Margaret had begun experiencing symptoms that her physicians initially attributed to the exhaustion that often followed intensive social seasons. The fatigue and digestive distress had seemed minor at first, easily explained by the demanding schedule that maintained her position at the center of London's most exclusive circles. The progression of her illness had been gradual but relentless, with symptoms that resisted all conventional treatments while following patterns that her medical attendants had never encountered. Her energy levels had declined steadily, while her once radiant complexion had taken on a pallor that cosmetics could not entirely conceal. Most mysteriously, the beautiful silk garments that had initially enhanced her appearance now seemed to drain color from her skin, making her appear increasingly ghostly despite the luxury of her attire. The Duchess's death, when it finally came after months of unexplained decline, had been attributed to a rare wasting disease that occasionally affected women of her age and social station. The autopsy had revealed no obvious cause for her deterioration, while the exotic nature of her symptoms had led physicians to speculate about unknown ailments that might have been contracted during her extensive travels to foreign countries. Lady Rosalind had attended the funeral with appropriate expressions of grief, carrying a wreath of flowers that had supposedly been cultivated in the same mysterious gardens where her finest silks originated. Her sorrow at losing such a devoted customer had seemed entirely genuine, while her offer to donate the deceased's remaining fabric purchases to charitable causes had enhanced her reputation for generous consideration of others' welfare. Yet even as society mourned the Duchess's unexpected passing, demand for Rosalind's exotic silks had continued to grow. The mysterious circumstances of Margaret's death had only increased the allure of fabrics that seemed to possess almost supernatural properties, while the dramatic enhancement that her final wardrobe had provided had convinced other wealthy women that such materials were worth any risk that might be involved. Countess Eleanor Pemberton had been among the first to approach Rosalind about acquiring pieces from her most exclusive collection, her competitive nature having been inflamed by the attention that Duchess Margaret had received during her final social season. Eleanor's wealth exceeded even the late Duchess's resources, while her younger age promised that she could enjoy exotic fabrics for many years without the health complications that might have contributed to Margaret's unfortunate decline. The private consultation that Rosalind had conducted for Countess Eleanor had revealed new aspects of her customer's personality and circumstances that would influence both the selection of appropriate fabrics and the methods she would use to ensure optimal results. Eleanor's vanity was matched by her ruthlessness in social competition, making her an ideal subject for experiments that required subjects who would wear their enhanced garments frequently and prominently. The silk that Rosalind had recommended for Eleanor's wardrobe had come from what she described as imperial workshops, where forbidden techniques had been developed for creating fabrics worthy of empresses who demanded beauty that transcended mortal limitations. The material possessed characteristics that surpassed even the remarkable properties of Duchess Margaret's collection, with colors that seemed to change based on the wearer's emotions and patterns that created optical effects that enhanced natural beauty while concealing any physical imperfections. The construction of Eleanor's new wardrobe had been even more elaborate than the process that had created the Duchess's final collection, with Rosalind personally applying treatments to each piece that she claimed would ensure the fabrics maintained their extraordinary properties indefinitely. The Countess had been required to participate in several preparatory sessions where her measurements were combined with assessments of her skin tone, hair color, and personal style preferences to create garments that would be perfectly calibrated to her individual characteristics. Eleanor's debut in her new collection had created an even greater sensation than Duchess Margaret's final triumph, with observers struggling to understand how the same person could have been so dramatically transformed through changes in wardrobe alone. The silk seemed to make her luminous, as if she were lit from within by some source of radiance that made everyone around her appear pale and ordinary by comparison. But the pattern that had claimed Duchess Margaret had begun manifesting in Eleanor's experience as well, though the symptoms had developed even more rapidly than they had in her predecessor's case. The Countess's energy had begun declining within days of her social triumph, while her appearance had taken on an ethereal quality that was beautiful but somehow unsettling to those who observed her closely. Eleanor's death had followed within 6 weeks of her first wearing the imperial silk, a timeline that should have raised suspicions about the possible connection between her new wardrobe and her sudden decline. The exotic nature of her symptoms had been attributed to a tropical disease that she might have contracted during a recent visit to colonial territories, while the rapid progression had been explained by her physicians as resulting from delayed diagnosis of a condition that had been developing undetected for months. The loss of two prominent customers within such a short period might have damaged Rosalind's reputation under different circumstances, but the extraordinary beauty that both women had achieved during their final weeks had actually enhanced demand for her exclusive services. Society's most competitive women had concluded that the risk of exotic ailments was acceptable given the dramatic advantages that Rosalind's fabrics could provide in social and romantic competition. Lady Rosalind's expressions of grief at losing such valued customers had been accompanied by subtle suggestions that their deaths might have resulted from wearing inferior imitations of her work that had been produced by unscrupulous competitors seeking to capitalize on her reputation. The possibility that counterfeit versions of her exotic silks were circulating in London's fashion markets had provided plausible explanation for the mysterious ailments while directing suspicion away from her legitimate business operations. As autumn settled over London, Rosalind had begun receiving inquiries from an even more exclusive circle of customers who were willing to pay unprecedented sums for access to fabrics that promised beauty worthy of any risk that might be involved. The deaths of Duchess Margaret and Countess Eleanor had become cautionary tales that enhanced rather than diminished the allure of materials that could transform ordinary women into creatures of almost supernatural radiance. The Emporium's success had enabled Rosalind to expand her operations into larger premises while establishing connections with suppliers who could provide increasingly exotic materials for customers whose appetites for luxury seemed unlimited. Each new acquisition to her collection represented both artistic achievement and commercial opportunity, as wealthy women competed for access to fabrics that existed nowhere else in the civilized world. Yet behind Crimson Silk Emporium's elegant facade lay secrets that even Rosalind's most observant customers could never have suspected. The mysterious deaths that had befallen her most prominent clients were not unfortunate coincidences, but rather the intended outcomes of a systematic assassination program that used beauty itself as a weapon more deadly than any conventional poison. The transformation of Lady Rosalind from legitimate silk merchant to master assassin had begun during her extensive travels throughout the Silk Road's ancient trade routes, when a chance encounter with forbidden knowledge had revealed possibilities that conventional commerce could never provide. Her journey into the heart of Central Asia's most remote regions had originally been motivated by simple business ambitions, the desire to establish direct relationships with silk producers who could supply materials of unprecedented quality and exclusivity. The caravan that had carried Rosalind through the mountain passes of the Hindu Kush had included among its members an elderly Chinese woman known only as Mother Lu, whose apparent role as a textile trader concealed expertise in arts that few outsiders had ever been privileged to witness. Lu's knowledge extended far beyond mere silk production into realms that combined ancient botanical wisdom with techniques for manipulating fabric properties in ways that bordered on the supernatural. Mother Lu's initial assessment of Rosalind had been conducted through methods that seemed more like fortune-telling than business evaluation, involving careful study of her palm lines, facial structure, and vocal patterns that supposedly revealed character traits that would determine her suitability for advanced instruction. The old woman had concluded that Rosalind possessed the combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and aesthetic sensitivity necessary to master techniques that required years of dedication to perfect. The education that followed had taken place in a remote monastery where Lu maintained workshops that served purposes far removed from conventional religious activities. The monks who inhabited this isolated facility were revealed to be guardians of knowledge that had been accumulating for centuries, including methods for creating textiles that could influence the health and behavior of those who wore them through mechanisms that Western science could not explain. The foundation of this forbidden art lay in understanding that silk fibers possessed natural properties that made them ideal carriers for botanical essences that could be absorbed through the skin over extended periods of contact. Different plant extracts could produce various effects when properly processed and integrated into fabric, from subtle mood alterations to more dramatic physiological changes that could prove fatal given sufficient exposure time. Rosalind's natural aptitude for these techniques had impressed even Mother Lu, whose previous students had typically required years to master procedures that Rosalind had absorbed within months. Her background in legitimate textile trade had provided perfect preparation for understanding the technical aspects of fabric modification, while her competitive nature had supplied the motivation necessary to pursue knowledge that ordinary merchants would have found too dangerous to explore. The specific techniques that would later enable her assassination career had been taught in a series of workshops that combined practical instruction with theoretical understanding of the principles that governed how botanical essences could be bonded to silk fibers without degrading their textile properties. The most potent formulations required rare plants that grew only in specific mountain regions, along with processing methods that had been developed through centuries of experimentation by practitioners whose purposes had extended far beyond mere textile enhancement. The plants that provided the most effective toxic essences had been cultivated in secret gardens, maintained by the monastery's inhabitants, species that existed nowhere else in the world due to their extreme rarity and the specialized growing conditions they required. Some produced alkaloids that affected the nervous system in ways that mimicked natural diseases, while others contained compounds that gradually weakened the cardiovascular system until heart failure became inevitable. The beauty of these botanical poisons lay in their extremely slow onset and their similarity to symptoms that could be attributed to conventional ailments that affected wealthy women of advanced age. The extended exposure period required for fatal effects ensured that no obvious connection would be apparent between the initial contact with treated fabrics and the eventual development of life-threatening conditions. Mother Lu's most advanced teachings had covered methods for customizing toxic formulations based on individual victim profiles, taking into account factors such as body weight, general health, lifestyle habits, and genetic predispositions that would influence how quickly different poisons would produce their intended effects. This personalized approach ensured optimal results while maintaining the appearance of natural disease progression that would avoid arousing medical suspicion. The integration of these toxic essences into silk fabric required techniques that preserved both the poison's potency and the textile's desirable properties, creating materials that remained beautiful and luxurious while carrying death within their very fibers. The process involved multiple stages of chemical treatment that bound the botanical compounds to silk proteins in ways that ensured gradual release through skin contact, while preventing degradation that might reduce effectiveness. Rosalind's first experimental applications of these techniques had been conducted on fabrics intended for her own use, allowing her to test various formulations at sublethal concentrations while developing expertise in the precise measurements and timing required for optimal results. These trials had confirmed that properly treated silks could deliver controlled doses of botanical compounds that produced subtle physiological effects without creating obvious symptoms that might attract unwanted attention. The establishment of supply chains for the exotic plants required for her assassination program had necessitated maintaining connections with the monastery's network while developing alternative sources that could provide materials without arousing suspicion about their intended applications. Rosalind had established relationships with botanical collectors throughout Asia who believed they were supplying rare specimens for legitimate research purposes, never suspecting that their materials would be converted into instruments of murder. The technical infrastructure required for processing these botanical materials into textile treatments had been established in hidden workshops beneath Crimson Silk Emporium, where specialized equipment enabled the complex chemical procedures necessary to create assassins' fabrics that appeared identical to luxury textiles. The facility had been designed to operate without generating suspicious odors, sounds, or waste products that might attract unwanted attention from neighboring businesses or local authorities. The selection of initial victims had been based on careful analysis of potential targets who possessed characteristics that would make them ideal subjects for testing refined assassination techniques. Wealthy women with active social lives would ensure frequent wearing of treated garments, while those with existing health concerns would provide plausible explanations for symptoms that might develop during the poisoning process. Duchess Margaret Ashworth had been chosen not only for her wealth and social prominence, but also for her known vanity and competitive nature, traits that would ensure she would wear her enhanced wardrobe frequently and publicly. Her slightly advanced age and history of minor health complaints would provide medical cover for symptoms that might seem suspicious in younger, healthier subjects. The formulation that Rosalind had selected for the Duchess's assassination had been designed to produce effects that would develop gradually over several months, mimicking the progression of wasting diseases that occasionally affected women of her age and lifestyle. The specific botanical compounds had been chosen for their ability to interfere with cellular metabolism in ways that would create systemic weakness while avoiding the dramatic symptoms that might suggest deliberate poisoning. The application process for treating the Duchess's fabrics had required multiple stages of preparation that ensured even distribution of toxic compounds while maintaining the luxury appearance and feel that justified the astronomical prices Rosalind charged for her exclusive materials. Each garment had received individual attention to calibrate the poison concentration based on how frequently it was likely to be worn and how much skin contact it would involve. The success of Duchess Margaret's assassination had confirmed that Rosalind's techniques could produce the desired results while maintaining perfect cover for her activities. The gradual nature of the poisoning process had prevented any connection being drawn between the victim's new wardrobe and her subsequent decline, while the exotic symptoms had been attributed to rare diseases that provided plausible explanation for the unusual presentation. Countess Eleanor Pemberton's assassination had involved a more potent formulation that reflected Rosalind's growing confidence in her methods and her desire to test the limits of what could be achieved through textile-based poisoning. The accelerated timeline for Eleanor's death had been intended to demonstrate that assassination schedules could be controlled through appropriate selection and concentration of botanical compounds. The systematic nature of these murders had established Rosalind as more than merely a successful businesswoman. She had become an artist whose medium was death itself, creating beautiful objects that delivered destruction with precision that exceeded anything conventional weapons could achieve. Her customers paid fortunes for the privilege of being murdered, while society celebrated the beauty that her creations provided during their victims' final weeks of life. The perfect crime that Rosalind had developed transcended traditional concepts of assassination by converting the act of murder into an enhanced shopping experience that left victims grateful for their purchases even as those same materials slowly ended their lives. Her success had proven that the most effective weapons were those that appeared to be gifts, and that the most dangerous predators were those who appeared to be benefactors, providing luxury and beauty to those fortunate enough to afford their services. The systematic expansion of Rosalind's assassination program had required developing a comprehensive understanding of London's social hierarchy that would enable her to identify targets whose deaths would provide maximum benefit while minimizing risk of discovery. Her position as the capital's premier silk merchant provided perfect cover for studying the personal circumstances, financial resources, and social vulnerabilities of women whose elimination would serve purposes beyond mere commercial profit. Lady Catherine Blackwood had been selected for termination not because of any personal animosity, but because her investigation into certain irregularities in colonial trading arrangements threatened to expose corruption networks that Rosalind's business operations depended upon for acquiring the exotic materials essential to her assassination techniques. Catherine's reputation for thoroughness and her political connections made her a dangerous adversary whose continued existence posed unacceptable risks to carefully constructed supply chains. The challenge of eliminating someone who possessed both investigative skills and influential allies had required developing new approaches that went beyond the gradual poisoning methods that had proven effective against previous victims. Catherine's suspicious nature would make her resistant to accepting gifts or making purchases that seemed too convenient, while her habit of consulting multiple physicians about health concerns would create additional complications for methods that relied on misdiagnosis of exotic symptoms. The solution that Rosalind had devised involved exploiting Catherine's known passion for rare books and manuscripts, interest that provided opportunities for indirect contact with treated materials that would not arouse the suspicions that direct fabric purchases might have generated. A carefully orchestrated introduction through mutual acquaintances had led to invitations to private exhibitions where Catherine could examine historical textiles that supposedly illustrated the development of silk production techniques across different cultures and time periods. The manuscript that would serve as Catherine's death warrant had been prepared using techniques that Mother Lou's advanced training had covered, involving the application of contact poisons to paper and binding materials that would transfer to the reader's skin through normal handling. The toxic compounds used for this application had been selected for their ability to penetrate through fingertips, while producing delayed effects that would not become apparent until days after the initial exposure. Catherine's fascination with the historical document had ensured prolonged contact with the treated materials, while her scholarly enthusiasm had prevented her from taking the protective precautions that suspicious circumstances might have warranted. The poison that Rosalind had selected for this assassination had been designed to mimic symptoms of food poisoning that would progress to more serious complications, providing medical cover that would prevent detailed investigation of the actual cause. The success of Catherine's elimination had demonstrated that Rosalind's techniques could be adapted for targets who could not be approached through conventional textile sales, while establishing precedents for using literary and academic interests as vehicles for delivering lethal substances. This innovation had expanded the potential victim pool to include women whose wealth and influence made them attractive targets but whose personal habits made traditional silk-based assassinations impractical. Countess Victoria Ashworth had represented a more conventional target, whose elimination had been commissioned by family members who stood to inherit substantial wealth upon her death. The Countess's advanced age and declining health had made her a natural candidate for methods that would accelerate existing medical conditions while maintaining the appearance of natural causes that would satisfy inheritance requirements and insurance investigations. The consultation process for Victoria's commission had involved extensive discussion of timing requirements and symptom preferences that would ensure the assassination achieved its intended objectives, while avoiding complications that might delay estate settlements or attract unwanted legal attention. Rosalind's growing reputation within certain circles had begun attracting clients whose motives extended beyond personal vendetta to encompass financial planning and inheritance optimization. The silk collection that had been prepared for Countess Victoria had incorporated compounds that specifically targeted the cardiovascular weaknesses that her medical history had revealed, ensuring that her death would appear to result from heart failure that her physicians had been anticipating for months. The customization of toxic formulations based on individual medical profiles had become one of Rosalind's most sophisticated services, commanding premium fees from clients who required precise control over assassination schedules. Victoria's death had proceeded according to the agreed timeline, with symptoms developing exactly as her family had been led to expect based on Rosalind's consultations with their private physicians. The absence of any suspicious circumstances had enabled rapid estate settlement, while generating referrals from satisfied clients who appreciated the professional discretion and technical expertise that Rosalind's services provided. The establishment of Rosalind's reputation within London's criminal underground had attracted attention from sources that she had not previously considered, including foreign agents whose objectives required eliminating targets whose deaths needed to appear completely natural, while serving strategic purposes that extended beyond domestic concerns. These international commissions had provided opportunities for testing assassination techniques against subjects whose different ethnic backgrounds and dietary habits required modified approaches. Princess Katerina Volkov had been targeted not for personal reasons, but because her marriage negotiations threatened to create political alliances that certain European powers found unacceptable. The princess's position as a foreign visitor to London had provided perfect cover for assassination methods that would be attributed to unfamiliarity with local diseases rather than deliberate poisoning, while her temporary residence had limited the scope of potential investigations. The approach used for Princess Katerina had involved exploiting her fascination with English fashion and her desire to acquire wardrobe pieces that would enhance her social position during her stay in London. Rosalind's reputation for exclusive materials had made her establishment an inevitable destination for someone seeking to make impressive appearances at court functions and diplomatic receptions. The silk that had been selected for the princess's elimination had been treated with compounds that would interact specifically with medications that her medical attendants administered for chronic conditions that her previous physicians had been treating unsuccessfully for years. This approach had required extensive research into foreign medical practices and pharmaceutical substances that would enable precise prediction of how toxic interactions would develop. Princess Katerina's death had been attributed to complications arising from treatments that her foreign physicians had prescribed for conditions that English medical practitioners had been unable to diagnose accurately. The exotic nature of her symptoms had been explained as resulting from therapeutic approaches that were unfamiliar to local physicians, while the rapid progression of her decline had been attributed to delayed effects of medications that had been administered before her arrival in London. The international attention that had followed the princess's death had enhanced rather than damaged Rosalind's reputation, as foreign dignitaries had concluded that English luxury goods represented status symbols worthy of any risk that might be involved in their acquisition. Several European courts had begun seeking access to Rosalind's exclusive services, creating opportunities for commissions that extended her influence far beyond London's social circles. The expansion of Rosalind's client base to include international assassination contracts had required establishing secure communication methods and payment systems that could operate across national boundaries while maintaining the operational security necessary to protect all parties involved. The complexity of these arrangements had transformed her business from local criminal enterprise into sophisticated international operation that served clients whose identities and objectives remained carefully compartmentalized. The most lucrative commissions had involved targets whose elimination served multiple client objectives simultaneously, creating efficiency advantages that enabled reduced pricing while maintaining profit margins that reflected the technical sophistication and exclusive nature of services provided. Lady Margaret Pemberton's assassination had been commissioned by three separate parties whose interests converged on ensuring her death occurred before certain business transactions could be completed. The coordination required for multi-client assassinations had demanded developing project management techniques that ensured all parties received the specific outcomes they had contracted for, while maintaining complete confidentiality about the involvement of other clients. Rosalind's growing expertise in managing complex contracts had established her as the preferred provider for situations that required elimination services too sophisticated for conventional criminal organizations. The evolution of her practice from individual assassinations to systematic elimination programs had attracted attention from clients whose objectives involved reshaping entire social networks through selective removal of key individuals. These campaigns required careful planning and execution schedules that could eliminate multiple targets while maintaining the appearance of natural causes that would prevent investigations from connecting seemingly unrelated deaths. The most ambitious project that Rosalind had undertaken involved eliminating 7 women whose combined influence in charitable organizations threatened to expose corruption networks that extended throughout London's financial and political establishment. The campaign had been designed to span 18 months, while using different assassination methods that would prevent patterns from emerging that might suggest coordinated activities. The success of this systematic elimination program had established Rosalind as more than merely an assassin. She had become an architect of social change, who could reshape power structures through carefully planned removal of individuals whose continued existence threatened her clients' interests. Her techniques had evolved beyond simple murder to encompass strategic planning that treated assassination as a form of social engineering. The reputation that these achievements had earned within London's most exclusive criminal circles had attracted clients whose resources enabled them to commission services that transcended conventional assassination to approach the level of artistic performance. These elite clients demanded not merely death, but beautiful deaths that enhanced rather than diminished their victims' reputations while serving objectives that remained invisible to outside observation. As her 4th year of systematic assassination activities concluded, Rosalind had achieved a position of influence that extended far beyond what conventional criminal enterprise could provide. Her client list included names that represented the highest levels of political, financial, and social power, while her techniques had become so sophisticated that detection remained impossible even when investigators possessed detailed knowledge of her methods. The perfect crime that Rosalind had perfected served multiple constituencies simultaneously. Clients received precisely controlled elimination services that achieved their objectives while maintaining perfect cover. Victims experienced enhanced beauty and social success during their final weeks, and society benefited from the removal of individuals whose continued existence would have created problems that conventional legal processes could never have addressed adequately. Her deadly collection continued growing with each new commission, representing achievements in assassination artistry that transcended traditional concepts of murder to become a form of social service that improved overall conditions for everyone except the individuals who had been selected for elimination. Rosalind had proven that the most effective forms of crime were those that appeared to be humanitarian activities that served the greater good, while generating substantial profits for those skilled enough to provide such specialized services. The first person to detect the systematic nature of Lady Rosalind's assassination program was Emma Whitmore, a young botanist whose research into exotic plant importation had uncovered patterns that conventional investigators had failed to recognize. At 27, Emma possessed both the scientific training necessary to identify unusual toxic compounds and the investigative instincts required to pursue dangerous knowledge despite the personal risks that such curiosity might entail. Emma's involvement in the case had begun when her academic research into medicinal plants brought her into contact with customs records that documented the importation of rare botanical specimens whose legitimate uses could not be satisfactorily explained by their supposed purchasers. The quantities and varieties of exotic plants being imported by certain London merchants suggested applications that extended far beyond conventional pharmaceutical or agricultural purposes. The pattern that had attracted Emma's attention involved shipments that consistently included combinations of plants whose primary shared characteristic was their potential for producing toxic compounds that could affect human physiology in subtle but potentially fatal ways. Most disturbing was the discovery that these shipments were being received by businesses whose legitimate operations provided no obvious reason for acquiring such specialized botanical materials. Crimson Silk Emporium had appeared on Emma's list of suspicious importers due to customs declarations that listed rare plant materials as components in textile dyes and fabric treatments, explanations that Emma's botanical knowledge suggested were either fraudulent or incomplete. The specific plants being imported possessed properties that would make them unsuitable for conventional textile applications, while being ideally suited for creating the kind of slow-acting poisons that could be absorbed through skin contact. The investigation that Emma had undertaken required gaining access to the silk merchant's operations while avoiding the attention of anyone who might be monitoring inquiries into the business's activities. Her credentials as a legitimate botanical researcher had provided cover for making contact with Rosalind under the pretense of studying traditional Asian textile production methods that incorporated rare plant materials. The initial consultation at Crimson Silk Emporium had provided Emma with opportunities to observe both the legitimate aspects of Rosalind's business and subtle indicators that suggested more sinister activities. The silk merchant's knowledge of plant properties had exceeded what normal textile applications would require, while her evasive responses to certain questions had suggested familiarity with botanical uses that she preferred not to discuss in detail. Most significantly, Emma's trained senses had detected chemical odors in the Emporium's basement areas that were consistent with the processing of toxic plant materials, evidence that confirmed her suspicions about the true nature of some of the imported botanical specimens. The presence of specialized equipment for extracting and concentrating plant essences had provided additional confirmation that Rosalind's operations extended far beyond legitimate textile enhancement. The breakthrough in Emma's investigation had come through analysis of fabric samples that she had discreetly obtained during her consultation, using techniques that revealed the presence of botanical compounds that had been integrated into the silk fibers through methods that were clearly intended to enable gradual release through skin contact. The specific combination of toxic substances had been designed to produce effects that would mimic natural disease progression while ensuring fatal outcomes given sufficient exposure time. The correlation between Emma's chemical analysis and the documented deaths of several prominent women who had been known customers of Crimson Silk Emporium had established clear evidence of systematic assassination activities that had been operating undetected for years. The sophisticated nature of the poisoning methods explained why conventional medical investigations had failed to identify the true causes of deaths that had been attributed to natural causes. Emma's attempts to share her discoveries with appropriate authorities had been complicated by the extraordinary nature of her accusations and the social prominence of both the suspected perpetrator and her alleged victims. Claims about exotic plant poisons being integrated into luxury textiles for assassination purposes seemed too fantastical to be credible, while the complete absence of any previous suspicions about Rosalind's activities made Emma's evidence appear to be the product of an overactive imagination rather than legitimate scientific investigation. The decision to confront Rosalind directly had been motivated by Emma's realization that conventional law enforcement was ill-equipped to address crimes that utilized methods beyond their technical understanding, while the continued operation of the assassination program posed ongoing risks to women whose only crime was possessing wealth that made them attractive targets for elimination. The meeting between Emma and Rosalind had taken place in the silk merchant's private office, surrounded by examples of the beautiful fabrics that had served as vehicles for delivering death to their unsuspecting purchasers. Emma's presentation of her evidence had been delivered with scientific precision, while her questions had demonstrated comprehensive understanding of the technical methods that had enabled the assassination program's success. Rosalind's response to Emma's accusations had been neither defensive nor apologetic, but rather reflected the calm confidence of someone who had long anticipated this confrontation and prepared comprehensive strategies for managing such situations. Her explanation of the assassination program had been delivered with the same professional pride that characterized her discussions of legitimate textile arts, presenting systematic murder as a sophisticated service that served important social and economic functions. The philosophical justification that Rosalind had developed for her activities drew upon observations about systemic problems that affected society's elite, arguments that her elimination services provided solutions that conventional legal processes could never achieve. Her clients, she explained, included individuals whose continued existence created obstacles to progress and prosperity that could only be addressed through selective removal of problematic personalities. The women who had been eliminated through her services had been chosen not through personal animosity, but through careful analysis of their roles in creating social, political, or economic problems that threatened the welfare of more deserving individuals. Their deaths had freed resources and opportunities that could be better utilized by people whose contributions to society warranted such advantages. Emma's attempts to argue for alternative approaches that might address these problems without resorting to murder had been met with patient explanations of why conventional methods had proven inadequate to deal with the complexity and urgency of the situations involved. Legal processes were too slow and uncertain, while social pressure and economic incentives had proven insufficient to modify behavior patterns that created ongoing harm to others. The turning point in their conversation had come when Rosalind had offered to demonstrate the humanitarian benefits of her services by allowing Emma to observe the positive changes that had resulted from selected eliminations, providing access to case studies that illustrated how targeted assassinations had improved conditions for numerous individuals who had been suffering under the influence of the removed targets. But Emma's scientific training had prepared her to recognize that no amount of utilitarian justification could legitimize systematic murder, regardless of the benefits that such activities might provide to third parties. Her moral objections to Rosalind's program had remained firm despite the silk merchant's persuasive arguments and compelling evidence about the positive outcomes that had resulted from her intervention. The revelation of Emma's intransigence had prompted Rosalind to modify her approach from philosophical persuasion to practical demonstration of the consequences that would result from attempting to expose assassination activities that served powerful clients whose identities and objectives would not tolerate public scrutiny. Emma's choice had been reduced to accepting a consulting role within the organization or experiencing firsthand the effectiveness of methods that she had been investigating. The silk scarf that Rosalind had presented as a token of their new professional relationship had been treated with the same compounds that Emma's analysis had identified in fabrics worn by previous victims, ensuring that she would experience gradual onset of symptoms that would provide comprehensive education about the technical sophistication of assassination methods she had been studying. Emma's acceptance of the poisoned scarf had not reflected surrender to Rosalind's intimidation, but rather represented a calculated decision to gather additional evidence while testing antidote procedures that her botanical research had suggested might provide protection against the specific toxic compounds that the silk merchant employed in her assassination program. The protective measures that Emma had developed drew upon her extensive knowledge of plant-based toxicology and traditional remedies that various cultures had used to counteract poisoning from similar botanical sources. Her preparation had included consuming compounds that would bind with absorbed toxins while strengthening her immune system's ability to process foreign substances without sustaining permanent damage. But Rosalind's expertise in assassination techniques had prepared her for subjects who might attempt to resist or counteract her methods, while her years of experience had taught her to recognize signs of protective preparations that could interfere with intended outcomes. Emma's scholarly confidence in antidote procedures had underestimated both the sophistication of Rosalind's poisoning methods and the silk merchant's ability to adapt her techniques when dealing with informed opposition. The formulation that had been applied to Emma's scarf incorporated multiple toxic compounds that worked synergistically to overwhelm protective measures while producing effects that could not be counteracted through conventional antidote procedures. The combination had been specifically designed to defeat the kind of protective strategies that someone with Emma's background might attempt, ensuring that academic knowledge would prove insufficient against practical experience gained through years of successful assassinations. Emma's initial confidence in her protective measures had begun to waver as symptoms developed that her antidote preparations had been designed to prevent, indicating that Rosalind's methods were even more sophisticated than her analysis had suggested. The progression of toxic effects had followed patterns that differed significantly from what her research had led her to expect, demonstrating that the silk merchant's techniques incorporated innovations that extended beyond traditional poison craft. The conversation that had followed Emma's recognition of her deteriorating condition had revealed the full extent of Rosalind's criminal empire and the international scope of clients whose objectives required elimination services that conventional criminal organizations could not provide. Emma had been granted access to information that would have enabled comprehensive exposure of assassination networks that extended throughout Europe's political and commercial establishments. However, the knowledge that Emma had gained about Rosalind's operations had come at the cost of her ability to act upon such information, as the progression of her poisoning had created physical and mental limitations that made effective resistance increasingly difficult. Her scientific understanding of what was happening to her body had enhanced rather than reduced the psychological impact of experiencing systematic murder through methods that she could analyze but not prevent. Rosalind's final offer to Emma had involved joining the assassination program as a technical consultant, whose botanical expertise would enable development of new poisoning methods, while ensuring that her knowledge would be used to enhance, rather than expose, existing operations. The alternative was accepting the inevitable progression of toxin effects that would result in death within days, though her final weeks would be made as comfortable as possible in recognition of her valuable contributions to understanding the technical aspects of exotic poisoning techniques. Emma's decision to accept the consulting position had been motivated not by fear of death, but by recognition that working within Rosalind's organization would provide opportunities to document criminal activities while potentially developing countermeasures that could protect future victims. Her apparent surrender had concealed determination to gather evidence that could eventually lead to the assassination network's exposure and destruction. The integration of Emma into Rosalind's organization had proceeded smoothly, with her botanical expertise immediately proving valuable for identifying new plant sources and developing improved formulations that could achieve assassination objectives with even greater precision and reliability. Her scientific approach to poison development had enhanced the technical sophistication of services that Rosalind could offer to clients whose requirements demanded exceptional discretion and effectiveness. The workshop that had been established for Emma's research activities had been equipped with apparatus that enabled systematic testing of toxic compounds while maintaining the security necessary to prevent unauthorized access to sensitive materials and information. Her work had involved not only developing new assassination methods, but also improving existing techniques to reduce the risk of detection while increasing the reliability of fatal outcomes. Emma's first independent contribution to the assassination program had been a delivery system that could integrate toxic compounds into cosmetic products, enabling elimination of targets through beauty treatments that would appear to enhance rather than threaten their victims' welfare. The method had been tested successfully on a client's wife, whose continued existence had complicated inheritance arrangements that required resolution before certain business transactions could be completed. The success of this cosmetic poisoning technique had demonstrated Emma's value to the organization while establishing her credibility with clients whose requirements extended beyond conventional textile-based assassination methods. Her reputation within criminal circles had grown rapidly as word spread about innovative approaches that could eliminate targets through mechanisms that victims would actually seek out and pay for themselves. The psychological adaptation that Emma had undergone during her first months with Rosalind's organization had been more complete than she had anticipated when accepting the consulting position. The daily exposure to assassination planning and execution had gradually normalized activities that her previous moral framework would have found unconscionable, while the technical challenges involved in developing new murder methods had provided intellectual satisfaction that competed with ethical objections. Most significantly, Emma had begun to appreciate the utilitarian arguments that Rosalind had presented for systematic elimination of individuals whose continued existence created obstacles to progress and prosperity. Her work with specific case studies had revealed numerous instances where targeted assassinations had produced benefits that extended far beyond the immediate objectives of paying clients, creating positive outcomes for individuals and communities that had been suffering under the influence of removed targets. The moral transformation that Emma had experienced had been facilitated by careful selection of initial assignments that involved targets whose elimination could be justified through conventional ethical frameworks, gradually progressing to cases that required more complex moral reasoning, while maintaining focus on beneficial outcomes that assassination activities had enabled. Lady Patricia Worthington had been Emma's most challenging assignment yet, requiring development of elimination methods that could overcome the enhanced security measures that protected someone whose position in government intelligence services had made her aware of threats that ordinary citizens never encountered. The techniques that Emma had developed for this commission had demonstrated her growing mastery of assassination arts, while establishing her reputation for solving problems that defeated less skilled practitioners. The success of Patricia's elimination through cosmetic products that had been modified using Emma's innovations had attracted attention from international clients whose objectives required assassination services that could operate within highly secure environments where conventional methods would be detected immediately. Emma's scientific background had enabled development of approaches that utilized advanced chemistry and botanical knowledge to achieve results that appeared completely natural even under intensive investigation. The expansion of Emma's role within Rosalind's organization had culminated in her appointment as technical director for research and development activities that would ensure the assassination program remained ahead of evolving security measures and detection methods. Her work had become essential to maintaining the competitive advantages that kept Rosalind's services in demand among clients whose requirements demanded the highest levels of sophistication and reliability. The final tapestry that represented Emma's ultimate integration into the criminal organization had been woven from threads that included her own voluntary participation in activities that she had originally sought to expose and prevent. Her transformation from investigator to accomplice had been accomplished through methods that were more sophisticated than simple coercion or intimidation, involving psychological manipulation that had redirected her moral sensibilities while preserving her technical capabilities. The research facility that Emma now directed had become the most advanced poison development laboratory in Europe, producing innovations that enabled assassination techniques that exceeded anything available through conventional criminal sources. Her work had elevated Rosalind's services from mere murder for hire to cutting-edge elimination technologies that could solve problems that no other methods could address. As Emma's third year with the organization concluded, she had achieved recognition as one of Europe's most accomplished assassination technicians, though her reputation was known only within circles that specialized in services too dangerous or sophisticated for ordinary criminal networks. Her botanical expertise had revolutionized poisoning methods, while her scientific approach had created systematic procedures that could train new practitioners in techniques that had previously required years of apprenticeship to master. The perfect synthesis that Emma and Rosalind had achieved between scientific knowledge and practical assassination experience had created an organization that operated beyond the reach of conventional law enforcement, while serving clients whose objectives required solutions that legal processes could never provide. Their work had transcended simple criminal enterprise to become a form of social engineering that used selective elimination to optimize conditions for individuals and organizations whose continued prosperity served broader economic and political objectives. The deadly collection that surrounded them had grown to include innovations that would have seemed impossible when Emma had first begun investigating suspicious plant importations, demonstrating that the most effective forms of crime were those that embraced rather than rejected advances in knowledge and technology. Rosalind and Emma had proven that assassination could be elevated to an art form that served humanitarian purposes while generating profits that reflected the technical sophistication and exclusive nature of services that only they could provide. Their triumph was complete, their methods undetectable, and their future secured through reputation for excellence that attracted clients whose resources and influence ensured continued protection from interference by authorities who lacked both the knowledge and the courage necessary to challenge operations that served the interests of society's most powerful individuals. The Silk Road assassin and her scientific partner had created more than a criminal enterprise. They had established a new form of social service that would endure as long as human ambition created demand for elegant solutions to problems that conventional methods could never adequately address.